world has gone mad. While the U.S. stock market shatters all-time high records and the largest corporations rake in never-before-seen profits, the middle class of America essentially teeters on extinction, and the margin between the average person and homelessness grows ever thinner. Of course, the chasm between the rich and the poor is widening to the point of being nearly unbridgeable. Tent cities can be found in some of the most wealthy parts of the wealthiest nation on the world. The unbalanced so-called global markets founded on trade agreements which only benefit the royal monopoly of a few corporations are partially to blame. Failed policies or political blunders are not the only cause of the crisis we're facing today. Indeed, it seems the death throes of our once great country are the result of a psychopathic elite bent on their own enrichment and aggrandizement, regardless of the devastating effects their actions have on the rest of us. Our political system is run by the corporations, for the corporations, and to the benefit of corporations from now until eternity, yet most people are led to believe we somehow live in a free democracy where we can vote to change the course. In truth, nobody ever voted to have a so-called Federal Reserve Bank, which is absolutely not federal at all, and indeed has no reserves, but is instead a for-profit scam run by psychopathic corporations who probably have no ties to American culture in many cases, and certainly have no ties to the American government at all. Certainly no oversight or even auditing ever being done on the non-federal, non-reserve bank. The non-federal bank, which holds no reserves, is the number one enemy facing our people, as the very lifeblood of our nation is being vampired away to enrich a staggering few, as our so-called government sits idly by, never to so much as mention or even acknowledge that we have a problem with the foundations of our financial structure. But the non-federal bank, which holds no reserves, isn't the only problem we face, but is indeed just a tip of the iceberg. I've lived in the southeast so-called Bible Belt more or less for the last 15 or 20 years, and we have increasingly been forced to compete with illegal immigrants for work in jobs which are now almost exclusively done by people who have entered the country illegally and are living here under assumed stolen identities. Now, while I don't necessarily have any animosity or anger against the individual people living and working here illegally, I certainly will not pretend to be happy about the situation. Very recently, we finally saw at least some of the suddenly closed down Walmart stores and what they're actually being used for. Of course, this was all just a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory just a couple weeks ago, but now that mainstream media has covered the fact that the children of detained illegal immigrants are indeed being detained in federally organized and taxpayer-funded shelters. Of course, the only reason we're allowed to hear about this really staggering news on the mainstream is because the narrative goes that Trump is responsible for the policy landing these children in these taxpayer-funded centers. So this is good news for the narrative, although these policies were put in place years ago under the Obama administration. Were there no political need to allow this news onto the mainstream outlets, then we'd have absolutely never seen it on the TV. And so the fact that closed down Walmarts are actually housing thousands of people would still be a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory were it not good for this anti-Trump, anti-right narrative. Now, while I'm in no way a blind supporter or even really a supporter at all of the current administration, I must say that I would align myself with the ideals of the so-called right-wingers these days, rather than the often crazy far leftists who are more concerned with gender pronouns than these actual atrocities going on right in front of them. Due to political pressure, the president signed an executive order to suggest keeping illegal immigrants' families together when the parents are incarcerated, waiting to be deported. What will the government do to help American families in similar situations? So let's say a couple live with two children and one of them gets arrested for growing pot in a state where it's illegal. Well, actually, both of them would be arrested, whether one of them knew about this or not. But does anyone think that the day will ever come when this couple would be allowed to keep their children with them in jail while awaiting trial? Such a thing will never happen, and indeed the parents would be locked up behind bars, their property confiscated, their assets frozen, and their children would become wards of the state. And frankly, I see growing pot as a far less serious so-called crime than illegally crossing the border, paying oftentimes for stolen identities or social security numbers, or even working under the table tax-free, sending large amounts of their earnings either way back overseas to their family, so that they too may one day join them in the land of opportunity for anyone but American citizens. Opportunity and equality for anyone but American citizens. Now, I realize that I'll be labeled as a bigot or a xenophobe for having these opinions. Hell, I may even see this video completely taken down or demonetized by the thought police because my opinions don't conform to what's politically correct at the moment or socially acceptable at the moment, even if the majority of the actual citizens in the country agree. While I certainly don't believe building a wall along our border will help this situation at all, nor will the relatively small amount of temporary jobs to build such a wall even put a small dent in the unemployment numbers. Not to mention, there are literally massive tunnel systems allowing for free travel of illegal immigrants peppered along our southern border. So building a wall would do absolutely nothing for those using these routes to illegally enter the U.S. Nothing would stop them from building more tunnels, and this would inevitably increase the number of tunnel systems used to bypass our border security, even if we built a 10,000-foot wall. Frankly, if nobody goes after the contractors who hire illegal immigrants, nothing will stop people from trying to establish routes. And I can't say that I blame them individually. Um, Hell, I might even pack up and move to Mexico to get me a job if this gets any worse. If our immigration policies are not enforced, then illegal immigrants have zero deterrent from skipping the border and setting up stakes, even if they build a wall. Could you imagine the outcry from the far left SJWs if the illegal immigrants were treated as heinously by the law as your average, say, pot grower or simple possessor? As a person who's been arrested for trumped up misdemeanor charges for possessing the wrong kind of plant, and I've seen friends and family members' lives ruined by the predatory prison system which punishes decent people for being poor in order to rake in taxpayer dollars to house them. I can't say that I agree that illegal immigrants should receive some sort of special treatment when they are being processed for breaking the law here. Where do we go? What do we do? Do we pick up stakes and move illegally to some other country, hoping to eke out a living there? Or do we rough it here in the land of broken dreams and lies? We certainly cannot afford to hire lobbyists to wine and dine our so-called representatives who are, in fact, mostly shills riding the revolving door between the corporations and the fascist government. Maybe that's what we should do, since our votes don't count. We'll start up a lobby to fork out just millions of dollars to our politicians in order to garner legislation that actually helps the majority of the people. That would be fairly ironic, but ineffective, as the multinational corporations of the world hold upwards of 90% of the nation's wealth and assets. So we, the broke-ass, sorry-ass people, couldn't even begin to compete. And I suppose that if our tax dollars went to anything that enriches the people at large, well, then that would make us socialist, and me a communist for supporting such a thing. So I don't really neatly fit into the left or the right side of this dichotomy spectrum, as most Americans also probably do not. In fact, it seems that the people who fit neatly into either the left or the right paradigm are becoming more and more polarized and extreme and unwilling to negotiate. So if I support basic programs to, say, help the homeless and impoverished Americans, then I'm a lefty socialist who must also support gay marriage, loathe Christians, and celebrate transgenderism. But if I am indeed a Christian in support of traditional family values, then I must also be for big tax breaks for the super rich, and I must also support building a wall along the Texas-Mexico border. I suppose we could start a political party comprised of people, normal people, the majority, who don't fit neatly into either of these left-right camps, but that would not conform to this whole dichotomy narrative, and so it would never be successful in anything but theory. The mainstream media outlets are, of course, mere mouthpieces for the government, and the government is a mere front group to hide the abhorrent situation going on with the non-federal bank without any reserves. And, of course, the out-of-control, greedy, rampant corporations that are ruining our country and our currency. This country is headed headlong towards a major revolution, and if you haven't seen that yet, then I don't know what to tell you. Oftentimes, I think that I would love to see it. Now, while I certainly do not support or condone violence of any sort, I'm also a human being with a will to survive, and in a country that I've paid taxes and unemployment insurance and disability insurance for my entire adult life, it's difficult to get any sort of support or a leg up in this Bible Belt here, except for, possibly food stamps. Many Americans who are in fact disabled, for example, find themselves waiting around for years after being denied disability benefits that they indeed have a right to and paid into for years in many cases. And this is just one example of the bureaucracy's ineffectiveness at doing what we the people have paid them and voted them into office to do. In a world where the truth and love are detested, while lies, violence, and hatred are celebrated, thanks to mainly the predictive programming and propaganda via the mainstream media, the place for moderate, normal people is becoming more and more scarce. Now, I will personally never conform to either of the current left-right dichotomy paradigm sections. So the only way people like myself will survive in this world is to either change the paradigm or change our personal values. And I don't think that that's a responsibility or a sacrifice, respectively, that we should have to take. Now, I pray to God often that He moves the world towards sanity and prosperity, love and respect for one another, but it just seems like that's getting further and further from the realm of possibility anymore. Things have gotten so bad in the last couple of decades, really since the 9/11 hostile corporate takeover of American power structures, but we still have a long way to fall if something isn't done about this situation. Things can and will get much, much worse if we don't do something to make major change in this country. Frankly, I see nothing short of a major upheaval jolting this country back to common sense. The people no longer have a voice or representation, and we're forced to pay taxes on every dollar that we earn and every dollar that we spend. Our taxes go to things like the militarized police force, who terrorize and brutalize our brothers and sisters and ourselves on a regular basis. These taxes go to things like bailing out the psychopathic banks who ruined our housing markets, getting us into much of this mess in the first place, or maybe sending guns to terrorist groups in the Middle East who then go and kill our soldiers with the weapons and ammunitions that our crooked-ass government sends them. Anyone with illusions of the world coming to its senses spontaneously is just kidding themselves. Corporations who care for nothing but profit at the expense of everyone else will simply not stop slow killing us and bleeding us dry unless they're forced to. And the selected governmental figureheads will never dare do such a thing or even acknowledge the fact that these rampant, out of control corporations are just a huge problem for the well being of our people. God help us all.